Chapter 1. Routine Disrupted. The summer sun cast a warm glow over the bustling streets of Oklahoma City, illuminating the vibrant energy of Bricktown. James Grady navigated his delivery truck through the familiar routes, taking in the sights and sounds that had become a comforting part of his daily routine. Laughter and music spilled out from the nearby cafes and outdoor events, creating a tapestry of urban life that James had grown to cherish. As he drove, James couldn't help but reflect on his love for this city. He had grown up here, raised by survivalist parents who had instilled in him a deep appreciation for self-sufficiency and preparedness. Even now, as he went about his job, the lessons of his youth lingered in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the importance of being ready for anything. Tuning into a podcast discussing the merits of stockpiling supplies and honing survival skills, James felt a familiar sense of purpose. The host's words resonated with him, validating his own instincts to always be prepared. He knew that the world could change in an instant, and he was determined to be the one in control of his own destiny. Pulling up to a local cafe, James made his delivery, exchanging pleasantries with the barista as he always did. However, as he stepped back outside, he couldn't help but overhear the anxious conversations among the patrons. Snippets of their discussions caught his attention. Reports of a strange flu-like illness spreading through the area, concerns about unusual symptoms, and increasing incidents of violence. James's unease grew as he listened, his survivalist instincts heightening. He tried to brush it off as just another rumor, but the chatter lingered in his mind, a nagging sense of foreboding that refused to be ignored. Back in his truck, James continued his deliveries, but the streets felt different. Fewer people were out and about, and those he did see appeared agitated and restless. As he drove past the Chesapeake Energy Arena, he witnessed a group of people behaving erratically, some stumbling and others shouting. A creeping sense of dread washed over him, and he glanced at the radio, where the news reports were becoming increasingly alarming. Warnings about quarantine zones and military deployments sent a chill down James's spine. The situation was escalating, and he knew he needed to act fast. Finishing his last delivery, he received a call from his mother, her voice laced with worry as she discussed the disturbing news reports. "James, have you been watching the news? They're saying it's some kind of outbreak, and the military is getting involved. I'm so worried," she said, her words tinged with fear. James felt a surge of protectiveness, the need to keep his family safe overwhelming him. "Mom, don't worry. I'm going to head home and start getting everything ready, just in case. You and Dad need to stock up on supplies, okay? I'll call you later," he replied, trying to sound reassuring despite the growing unease in the pit of his stomach. Driving through the eerily quiet streets, James's mind raced with thoughts of what might be coming. The world outside his truck seemed to be changing rapidly, and he knew he needed to be prepared. Arriving home, he immediately began assessing his supplies, pulling out the camping gear, medical kits, and non-perishable food that he had accumulated over the years. James's apartment was a reflection of his survivalist mindset, every item carefully organized and stored, ready for any eventuality. As he meticulously checked each item, he recalled the lessons his parents had taught him, the importance of self-sufficiency, the value of being prepared, and the need to adapt to the challenges that life might throw his way. The distant sounds of sirens echoed outside, and James glanced through the window, spotting emergency vehicles racing past. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew that the world he had once known was about to change, and he needed to be ready. Settling in for the night, James locked all the doors and windows, ensuring his sanctuary was secure. As he lay in bed, the sounds of chaos seeped into his consciousness, frantic voices, blaring alarms, and the occasional crash. Just as he began to drift off, a loud thud echoed from the street, jolting him awake. James sat up, his heart racing, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew that the world outside was changing rapidly, and he would need to be prepared for whatever came next. With a steely determination, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I'll be prepared for anything." The night was long, and the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on James's mind. But as the first rays of dawn began to peek through the curtains, He knew that he would need to face the challenges ahead, no matter what they might be. His survivalist instincts had prepared him for this moment, and he was ready to do whatever it took to protect himself and those he cared about. Chapter 2: Signs of Chaos. The once vibrant streets of Oklahoma City had been reduced to a ghostly hush, the familiar sights and sounds of Bricktown now muted by an unsettling tension. As James Grady navigated his delivery truck through the eerily quiet roads, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly amiss. The Devon Tower, a towering landmark that had once stood as a symbol of the city's prosperity, now cast an ominous shadow over the deserted streets below. James glanced around, noting the sparse pedestrian traffic and the anxious expressions on the faces of those he did see. Hushed whispers and furtive glances replaced the usual lively chatter, and the distant wail of sirens only added to the growing sense of unease. Turning the corner towards Penn Square Mall, James felt a chill run down his spine. The usually bustling shopping center now resembled a fortress under siege, with a small crowd of people gathered outside, their body language tense and apprehensive. As he pulled up to the delivery point, he couldn't help but overhear their hushed conversations. "Did you hear about that attack downtown? Someone just started biting and clawing at another person, like they were some kind of animal," a woman whispered, her eyes wide with fear. James strained to listen, his survivalist instincts heightening. Another voice chimed in. "The news is saying it's some kind of outbreak. They're talking about quarantines and the military getting involved." A chill ran down James's spine as he absorbed the implications of their words. An outbreak? Quarantines? The military? His mind raced, recalling the alarming reports he had heard on the radio earlier. The once familiar delivery stop now felt like a minefield, and he could feel the weight of the crowd's anxious gazes upon him. Quickly completing the drop-off, James hurried back to his truck, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt thick with tension, and he couldn't shake the sense that the world he had once known was rapidly unraveling. As he pulled out of the mall's parking lot, he glanced in his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the scattered groups of people, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Turning up the volume on the radio, James listened intently as the news anchors delivered a steady stream of disturbing reports. Hospitals were overwhelmed, the military had been deployed, and the government was urging citizens to stay indoors. The words echoed in his mind, amplifying the growing sense of dread that had taken root within him. James's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he navigated the streets, now dotted with abandoned vehicles and the occasional shattered storefront. The once vibrant city had been transformed into a landscape of chaos, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease about what lay ahead. As he approached his apartment, James's eyes scanned the area, searching for any signs of danger. The familiar surroundings now felt like a fragile sanctuary, and he knew he needed to act quickly to secure his home. Parking the truck, he hurried inside, locking the door behind him and taking a moment to catch his breath. James then went to his fridge where he grabbed his ice-cold fruit punch Rockstar drink. He cracked open the can, he took a big drink, then headed towards his living room window. Settling by the window, James peered out into the obscured street below, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The distant sounds of chaos, sirens, angry shouts, and the ominous thud of something heavy hitting the pavement filled the air, heightening his sense of isolation. He felt a growing sense of unease, realizing that the world outside was changing rapidly, and he would need to adapt to survive. As darkness began to blanket the city, James's gaze hardened with determination. He recalled the survival tactics he had learned from his parents, the podcasts he had listened to, and the countless hours he had spent preparing for the unexpected. This was the moment he had been training for, and he would not be caught off guard. Just as James decided to fortify his home, a sudden loud crash reverberated through the dark night, sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. He gripped the edge of the table, his heart racing as he thought about the dangers that lurked beyond his door. Chapter 3: The Outbreak. The eerie silence that permeated the streets of Oklahoma City jolted James Grady awake, shattering the familiar rhythms of his routine. As he peeled open his eyes, The world beyond his bedroom window had transformed overnight, the once vibrant city now cloaked in an unsettling stillness. Swinging his legs over the edge of the bed, James felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The comfortable confines of his apartment suddenly felt like a fragile sanctuary, the muffled sounds of chaos seeping in from the outside. Crossing the room, he peeked through the curtains, his heart pounding as he took in the scene unfolding before him. Debris littered the streets, abandoned vehicles dotting the landscape like forgotten sentinels. The air was thick with tension, and James could see faint wisps of smoke rising in the distance, a harbinger of the turmoil that had consumed his city. The familiar landmarks he had grown to cherish, the Devon Tower, the Chesapeake Energy Arena, the bustling Penn Square Mall, now stood as eerie reminders of the world that had been lost. Turning his attention to the radio, James listened intently as the news anchors delivered a barrage of alarming reports. Hospitals were overwhelmed, the military had been deployed, and the government was urging citizens to stay indoors. The words echoed in his mind, amplifying the growing sense of dread that had taken root within him. James's survivalist instincts kicked into high gear. He moved with purpose, quickly dressing and gathering the supplies he had meticulously accumulated over the years. Canned goods, bottled water, first aid kits, and an array of tools that were carefully organized, each item a testament to his readiness for the unexpected. As he moved through his apartment, the sound of shattering glass and loud unknown noises outside jolted him, and he instinctively crouched low, peering through the window to catch a glimpse of the chaos unfolding below. He watched in horror as a group of people, their faces twisted with rage and fear, attacked a car that had become trapped in the street. The driver desperately tried to escape, but the crowd overwhelmed him, their actions driven by a primal desperation that chilled James to the core. This revelation kicked his sense of urgency to fortify his home into high gear, to create a sanctuary in the midst of the unfolding pandemonium. He moved with precision, securing the doors and windows, barricading any potential entry points. The rhythmic clanging of the cans against one another echoed in the silence, underscoring the weight of the situation. Just as James finished his preparations, a loud knock on the door startled him. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the baseball bat he kept near the entrance. Cautiously approaching the door, he peered through the peephole and was relieved to see his neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, looking frazzled and terrified. Carefully opening the door, James watched as Mrs. Jenkins burst in, her eyes wild with fear. "James, oh, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. I saw it happen. My husband, he." Her words trailed off, choked by a sob. James ushered her inside, closing the door firmly behind them. Guiding her to a chair, he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his own heart racing with the weight of her words. "Mrs. Jenkins, what happened?" he asked, his voice low and steady, belying the turmoil within. Through tears and gasps, Mrs. Jenkins recounted the horrifying scene she had witnessed. Her husband, once a kind and gentle man, had transformed into one of the undead, his features twisted and his movements erratic. She had watched in helpless terror as he attacked her. His once familiar face, now a bloody, rage-filled mask of hunger and rage. James listened, his mind reeling with the implications of her story. The fragility of human life had never been more apparent, and the realization that the world he had once known was rapidly unraveling sent a chill down his spine. As Mrs. Jenkins wept, James felt a surge of protectiveness, a deep-rooted need to ensure her safety in the midst of this unfolding nightmare. Together, they assessed their situation, exchanging information about the rapidly deteriorating conditions in the neighborhood. James learned that several homes had been abandoned, their occupants either fleeing or succumbing to the chaos. The air was thick with smoke, and the distant sounds of screams and gunshots only heightened their sense of fear. Mrs. Jenkins wanted to go check on her neighbors. She was kind soul, a caring soul, the type that's the first to get killed in these situations. James agreed to walk with her to check on the neighbors, not because he gave a fuck, but because he needed more supplies for his personal needs. As they prepared to venture outside, James reflected on the importance of strength in numbers, even as his paranoia continued to gnaw at him. He knew that trust would be a precious commodity in this new reality, but the need for community and mutual support had never been more apparent. Steeling himself for the dangers that lay ahead, James opened the door, stepping out into the eerie silence of the transformed city. The scene that greeted them was one of overwhelming disbelief. The streets were littered with remnants of a once thriving community, broken glass, overturned trash cans, and signs of struggle. The air was thick with tension, and the distant sounds of screaming and car horns echoed in the background, a constant reminder of the precarious nature of their situation. As they walked cautiously through the neighborhood, James and Mrs. Jenkins encountered a group of survivors barricaded in a nearby house, their faces gaunt and eyes filled with fear. Approaching them with caution, James listened as they shared information about the escalating violence and the dire need for supplies. This meeting underscored the harsh reality of their circumstances. Trust was scarce, and alliances were fragile in a world where survival was to become a daily battle. Returning to the relative safety of James's apartment, he and Mrs. Jenkins discussed the possibility of forming a group to look out for one another. They realized that their survival may depend on collaboration, on the strength of community in the face of overwhelming adversity. James felt a newfound sense of purpose, a determination to protect those around him and to forge a path through the chaos. However, a sense of foreboding loomed over them as they heard distant growls and screams echoing through the streets, reminding them that danger was ever present. James locked the door behind them and barricaded it with a 2x4 across the door in hopes that would stop or slow down any intruders. They would need to prepare for the worst and face the challenges ahead, united in their struggle for survival. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape, James knew that the world he had once known was gone. In its place, a new reality had emerged, one that demanded adaptability, resilience, and the willingness to fight for every moment of life. With a deep breath, he turned his attention to the task at hand, determined to do whatever it took to keep himself and those he cared about alive in this new, unforgiving world. Chapter 4: Scavenging for Survival. The eerie silence that had blanketed the once vibrant streets of Oklahoma City only heightened James Grady's sense of unease as he moved through his apartment, his every step weighted with purpose. The world outside had been transformed, a haunting landscape of chaos and uncertainty, and he knew he needed to be prepared for whatever lay beyond his door. With a steely determination, James meticulously organized his supplies, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for the unexpected. Canned goods, bottled water, and a well-stocked medical kit were carefully arranged on the cluttered table, each item a testament to his survivalist mindset. As he double-checked his camping gear, the faint sounds of distant screams and horns pierced the stillness, sending a chill down his spine. James paused, his heart racing, as he strained to listen, his mind cataloging the implications of the chaos unfolding outside. Recalling the lessons his parents had instilled in him from a young age, James muttered survival tips under his breath, the words a mantra to keep him focused. Always have a backup plan. Never leave home without essential supplies. Be prepared for anything. These principles had guided him through life, and now, in the face of this unfolding nightmare, they would be his guiding light. With a renewed sense of urgency, James donned his tactical backpack, filled with the gear he had meticulously curated over the years. Gripping his trusty baseball bat, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges that lay ahead. He told Mrs. Jenkins to stay put, don't make a sound. I'll be back soon. As he stepped outside, the stark contrast of his once familiar neighborhood sent a jolt of unease through him. The streets were littered with debris, abandoned vehicles, dead bodies, and the remnants of a life that had been abruptly shattered. James's eyes scanned the area, his senses heightened, every sound amplifying his anxiety. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional crunch of broken glass beneath his feet, a haunting soundtrack to this new reality. Approaching the nearest convenience store, James found the entrance blocked by overturned shelves and shattered glass. Carefully making his way inside, he felt a sense of foreboding as the dimly lit interior enveloped him. The air was thick with the scent of decay. and the shadows seemed to conceal unknown dangers. James's grip tightened on his baseball bat as he moved cautiously through the aisles, his eyes searching for any useful supplies or food. The store had been ransacked, with items strewn haphazardly across the floor, but he knew he needed to find what he could. Suddenly, a low groan echoed from the back of the store, sending a chill down James's spine. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, as he realized he might not be alone. Crouching behind a shelf, he peered around, his breath held in anticipation as he searched for the source of the sound. The groan grew louder, and James's instincts kicked in. Reaching for his baseball bat, he prepared to defend himself, his muscles tensing in anticipation of the confrontation. Slowly, he positioned himself to take a swing, his eyes fixed on the shadowy figure that was now stumbling into view. As the disheveled, bloodied figure of a female zombie emerged, James felt a surge of visceral fear. The creature's vacant eyes and contorted features, she was once a businesswoman, still dressed with only a skirt on, her bare breasts all bloody just hanging there perfectly. James, though, to himself, "You were beautiful at one time." With a surge of courage, James swung his bat, the impact to the head, the sound of bone cracking, sending the zombie crashing to the ground. The moment was both exhilarating and horrifying, as James grappled with the reality of taking a life, even if it was no longer human. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he paused, his breath ragged, as he processed the weight of his actions. This was just the beginning, he knew, the first of many difficult choices he would have to make in order to survive. Hastily gathering what little supplies he could find, James hurried out of the store, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just experienced. The streets were still eerily quiet, with the distant sounds of chaos serving as a haunting backdrop. Each shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat, and James remained vigilant, his senses on high alert. As he approached his apartment, the weight of his encounter with the zombie lingered heavily on his conscience. The fragility of life had never been more apparent, and he wrestled with the moral dilemmas that now accompanied his fight for survival. Entering his apartment and locking the door behind him, James felt a mix of relief and dread, knowing that his battle had only just begun. Stepping back into the relative safety of his home, James took a moment to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The apartment, once a comfortable retreat, now felt like a fragile sanctuary, a bulwark against the chaos that had consumed the world beyond its walls. With renewed determination, James set about fortifying his home, drawing on the lessons he had learned from a lifetime of preparation. He reinforced the windows, barricaded the doors, and ensured that every entry point was secured. The rhythmic clanging of the cans against one another echoed in the silence, underscoring the weight of his actions. As he worked, James's mind drifted to the fate of his neighbors and the broader community. The eerie stillness outside only heightened his sense of isolation, and he couldn't help but wonder about the well-being of those he had once known. The thought of their suffering weighed heavily on him, but he knew he couldn't afford to be distracted by the plight of others. His primary focus had to be on ensuring his own survival. Pausing to take a sip of water, James's gaze fell upon the small collection of photographs that adorned his living room. The images of his parents, his childhood home, and the vibrant city he had once called home felt like a distant memory, a relic of a world that had been irrevocably lost. Tracing the familiar faces with his fingertips, he felt a pang of grief, but he quickly pushed it aside, steeling himself for the challenges that lay ahead. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape, James knew that the night would bring new dangers. He moved with a renewed sense of purpose, ensuring that every possible entry point was secured, that his supplies were within easy reach, and that his makeshift sanctuary was as fortified as it could be. Settling into his chair, James gazed out the window, his eyes scanning the streets for any signs of movement. The distant sounds of chaos continued to echo, a constant reminder of the fragility of his existence. He knew that the world outside had changed, that the rules he had once lived by no longer applied, and that he would need to adapt if he was to survive. With a deep breath, James reached for his baseball bat, his grip tightening around the worn handle. He was ready, he told himself, ready to face whatever the night might bring. As the darkness enveloped the city, James Grady steeled himself for the battle that lay ahead, determined to protect his sanctuary and the life he had fought so hard to preserve. Chapter 5. The First Encounter. The dim light of dawn crept through the curtains, casting a pale glow over James Grady's apartment. As he lay in bed, the echoes of the previous day's chaos seeped into his consciousness, shattering the fragile illusion of normalcy. The silence of the morning was unsettling, broken only by the distant wail of sirens and the sporadic shouts that echoed through the empty streets. Wiping the sleep from his eyes, James remembered about Mrs. Jenkins. After yesterday's encounter with the zombie, I totally forgot about Mrs. Jenkins. James slowly creeped out of bed, grabbed his bat, and exited his bedroom. He walked down the hallway towards the room Mrs. Jenkins was sleeping in. He noticed the door cracked open. As he slowly pushed open the door, a loud gnarl noise came from behind him. It was Mrs. Jenkins. She was a fucking zombie, her crooked, gnarly teeth snapping at his face. James fell backwards onto the floor like a bumbling idiot. The zombie jumped on top of him, snapped and spitting blood all over his face. James pushed the zombie, who was one Mrs. Jenkins, off of him. He took his bat and with a swing, hit Mrs. Jenkins in the face, her lower jaw ripping off. James then hit her several more times until she was still in her own pool of blood. Glancing at the clock, James felt a surge of urgency. He couldn't afford to linger in the relative safety of his home. The world beyond his door had changed, and he needed to act quickly to secure the resources he would need to survive. James moved through his apartment with a sense of purpose, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered his survival gear. He carefully packed his tactical backpack, ensuring he had his baseball bat, a flashlight, and a few other essential items. As he double-checked his supplies, he couldn't help but recall the survival tips he often muttered to himself, a mantra that had become a soothing ritual in the face of uncertainty. Always be prepared. Never leave home without the essentials. Expect the unexpected. The words echoed in his mind, a steady drumbeat that helped to steady his nerves. With a deep breath, James steeled himself for the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that the world outside had changed, and he needed to be ready to face whatever dangers awaited him. Gripping the strap of his backpack, he stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, the weight of the situation pressing heavily upon him. The once familiar surroundings now felt ominous, the shadows casting an unsettling pall over the stairwell. James could hear the faint sounds of screaming drifting up from the street below, a constant reminder of the turmoil that had consumed his city. Each creak of the stairs amplified his anxiety, and he found himself gripping the handrail with a white-knuckled intensity. As he emerged onto the street, James was struck by the stark transformation of his neighborhood. The vibrant, bustling community he had once known had been reduced to a desolate landscape, littered with debris and the remnants of a life that had been abruptly shattered. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to conceal a multitude of threats. James's eyes scanned the area, his senses heightened, searching for any sign of danger. The distant sounds of growls and the occasional crash only heightened his unease, and he found himself gripping the strap of his backpack even tighter. Steeling himself, James began to make his way down the street, his steps measured and cautious. He approached a nearby 7-Eleven store, its windows shattered and its doors ajar, a haunting reminder of the panic that had swept through the city. Pausing at the threshold, he felt a surge of dread, unsure of what might await him inside. Pushing past his hesitation, James stepped over the broken glass, the crunch of it beneath his shoes echoing in the eerie silence. The interior was dark and foreboding, the shelves overturned and the contents scattered across the floor. Scanning the aisles, he began to fill his backpack with non-perishable items and bottled water, his heart racing with each sound that broke the stillness. Suddenly, a low groan pierced the air, causing James to freeze in place. The realization that he was sent him into a spiral of anxiety, and at the same time he felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Crouching behind a shelf, he gripped his baseball bat tightly, his eyes searching the darkness for the source of the sound. The groan grew louder, and James could hear the shuffling of feet approaching him. His breath quickened as he braced himself for a confrontation, his mind racing with the survival tactics his parents had drilled into him over the years. Peering around the shelf, he caught a glimpse of a disheveled figure, its vacant eyes and bloodied clothing a grotesque sight. In that moment, James felt a mix of fear and determination. He knew that he needed to act swiftly, that his very survival depended on his ability to defend himself. Recalling his parents' lessons, he positioned himself for a strike, his grip tightening around the worn handle of his bat. The tension built as the creature drew nearer, its movements erratic and unnatural. James's heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. With a surge of courage, he sprang into action, maneuvering around the shelf and swinging his bat with precision. The impact was sickening, the bat connecting with the zombie's head with a dull thud. The creature collapsed to the ground, lifeless once more. A rush of adrenaline flooded James's system. He stood there, his breath ragged, as he stared down at the motionless form at his feet. He felt different now, filled with an unsettling silence that amplified his internal struggle. He had taken another life, even if the creature was no longer human, and the weight of that realization threatened to overwhelm him. Shaking off the shock, James hastily collected a few more supplies, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just witnessed. The world outside had changed, and he knew that this was just the beginning of the horrors he would face in this unforgiving new reality. As he exited the store, the weight of his actions heavy on his conscience, James couldn't help but wonder what other challenges lay in store. The streets were still eerily quiet, save for the distant sounds of chaos, and he knew that he needed to get back home as soon as possible. With a deep breath, he got himself pumped up for the journey ahead, his determination to survive fueling his every step. The neighborhood was thick with tension as James made his way back to his apartment, his senses on high alert. The once familiar surroundings now felt like a fragile sanctuary, a bulwark against the chaos that had consumed the world beyond its walls. Each shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat, and James found himself gripping the strap of his backpack with a white-knuckled intensity. As he approached the entrance to his building, he paused, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the structure, and James felt a chill run down his spine. Cautiously, he pushed open the door, his heart racing as he stepped inside. The hallway was dimly lit, and James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as he made his way towards his apartment. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the stillness, and he found himself holding his breath, straining to hear any indication of a threat. Reaching his door, James fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling slightly. As he turned the lock, he half expected to be greeted by a horde of the undead, his mind racing with the possibilities of what might await him. He thought to himself, was Mrs. Jenkins still dead, or did she come back and waiting on the other side of the door to eat him? But when he pushed the door open, he was met with the familiar sights and sounds of his sanctuary, a wave of relief washing over him. Closing the door firmly behind him, James leaned back against it, his eyes sweeping the room. Everything was as he had left it, save for the supplies he had gathered from the convenience store. With a heavy sigh, he set down his backpack, his gaze drawn to the small collection of photographs that adorned the living room. The images of his parents, his childhood home, and the vibrant city he had once known felt like a distant memory, a relic of a world that had been irrevocably lost. Tracing the familiar faces with his fingertips, James felt a pang of grief, but he quickly pushed it aside, steeling himself for the challenges that lay ahead. As he moved through his apartment, James began to assess his supplies, meticulously organizing the items he had gathered. The rhythmic clanging of the cans against one another echoed in the silence, underscoring the weight of the situation. He knew that he would need to be prepared for anything, that the world outside had changed in ways he could scarcely comprehend. James realized he needs to do something with the zombie in the room before it starts to smell too bad. He rapped Bokes. The corpse of Mrs. Jenkins in a sheet dragged her body through the apartment, then threw her over the top rail of the balcony as her body thumped when it hit the ground. Settling into his chair, James gazed out the window, his eyes scanning the deserted streets for any signs of movement. The distant sounds of chaos continued to echo, a constant reminder of the fragility of his existence. He knew that the night would bring new dangers, and he needed to be ready to face them. With a deep breath, James reached for his baseball bat, his grip tightening around the worn handle. He was ready, he told himself, ready to protect his sanctuary and the life he had fought so hard to preserve. Chapter 6. Meeting Sarah, James's grip tightened on the strap of his backpack, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to reach out towards him, heightening his paranoia. He could hear the distant groans and the shuffling of feet, a constant reminder that the undead were never far away. Despite the weight of his recent encounter with the zombies and Mrs. Jenkins, James felt a surge of determination. He needed to find supplies and perhaps even other survivors if he was to have any hope of surviving in this new, unforgiving world. As he approached in the abandoned Chris Express Drugs pharmacy, James caught sight of a small group of survivors huddled together, their faces drawn with fear. He paused, his heart racing, unsure whether to approach them or keep his distance. The decision was made for him, however, as he overheard their hushed conversation. "We're running low on antibiotics and first aid supplies," one of the survivors, a middle-aged woman, whispered to the others. "We need to find more if we're going to have any chance of making it." Taking a deep breath, James stepped forward, his presence immediately drawing the wary gazes of the survivors. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and measured. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I may be able to help you find what you're looking for." The group tensed, their eyes narrowing as they assessed his intentions. James could feel the weight of their distrust, and his survivalist instincts kicked into high gear. He quickly explained his background, emphasizing his focus on gathering supplies and protecting those around him. As he spoke, the survivors' defenses began to slowly lower. They were intrigued by his knowledge and the idea of working together, their own desperation outweighing their initial caution. "The pharmacy might still have some medical supplies," James suggested, gesturing towards the dilapidated building. "If you're willing, I'd be happy to help you search for them." The group exchanged a series of wary glances. The tension could be cut with a butter knife. Finally, the middle-aged woman stepped forward, her expression guarded but resolute. "All right, we'll go with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we'll be keeping our eyes on you." James nodded and chuckled, understanding the fragility of their newfound friendship, if you want to call it that. "Fair enough," he replied, his own gaze hardening with determination. "Let's move out, but stay close and keep quiet. We don't know what else might be lurking in there." As they entered the pharmacy, the group's unease grew higher. The building was dark, its windows shattered and doors open, an inviting yet foreboding sight. James gestured for the others to stay back as he cautiously stepped inside, his senses heightened and his grip tightening on his baseball bat. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the store, and the air was thick with the stank of decay. Every creak and noise of the floorboards sent a jolt of adrenaline through James, his heart pounding in his chest. He moved with practiced efficiency, his eyes scanning the overturned shelves and scattered products as he searched for the medical supplies they so desperately needed. The tension outside was extreme, the group waiting anxiously as the sounds of the city echoed ominously in the background. James knew they were racing against time, and he could feel the weight of their survival hanging in the balance. Suddenly, a loud crash from the back of the pharmacy shattered the silence, causing James to freeze in place. Panic surged through him as he glanced towards the sound, and he instinctively raised his bat up into a swinging position, his heart pounding in his chest. Low growls and the sound of chaotic movements filled the store, and James knew they were not alone. The group outside began to murmur nervously, and he quickly motioned for them to be quiet, his eyes narrowing with determination. Preparing himself for the confrontation, James moved towards the source of the noise, his grip tightening on the worn handle of his bat. As he approached, he could make out the unmistakable figure of a zombie, staggering through the aisles, drawn by the commotion and noise. In that moment, James felt the weight of his responsibility for the group's safety. He readied himself, knowing that this encounter could be the difference between life and death, not just for him, but for the people standing outside of the pharmacy. James charged forward, swinging his bat with precision as it connected with the zombie's head. The sound of the bat hitting bone, crushing the creature's skull, blood splatter everywhere, like an exploding watermelon. The creature crumpled to the floor, lifeless once more, but the victory was short-lived. James heard more growls approaching from the back of the store, and he realized that the noise had attracted a horde. He quickly gathered the medical supplies he had managed to find, his heart racing as he gestured for the others to follow him. They made a hasty retreat, the sounds of growling and shuffling feet echoing behind them. James burst out of the pharmacy, running away from the pharmacy, adrenaline pumping as they sprinted down the street, narrowly escaping the clutches of the undead. As they reached a relative safe haven, James looked at the survivors, their faces a mix of fear and relief. They had survived this encounter together, forging a bond that may prove essential in the days to come. But he knew this was just the beginning of their struggles in a world filled with danger. "We need to keep moving," James said, his voice low and urgent. "The city's not safe anymore. We need to find a secure location, somewhere we can hunker down and hold out." The group nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. They had faced the horrors of the undead together, and in that moment, a fragile trust had begun to take root. James knew that they would need to rely on each other if they were to have any hope of surviving in this new, unforgiving world. As they moved through the desolate streets, James couldn't help but reflect on the weight of their situation. But in the midst of the chaos, he had found an unexpected allies, and he knew that their newfound friendship could be the key to their survival. The group moved with a sense of purpose, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. James took the lead, his mind racing with plans and strategies, his survivalist instincts guiding his every step. He knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was determined to see them through, no matter the cost. Then the surveyors stopped. They said to James, "We are not going any further with you. We are headed south to look for our friends and family. Thank you for helping us, but this is where we part ways." Then one of the surveyors, a female named Sarah, said, "I'm staying here with James. I have now family left alive. We are stronger in numbers. We should all stay." One of the other female survivors asked Sarah, "Are you sure, honey? You don't know that guy. What if he does something to you?" James then said, "I only want to help. I just want to build a group for survival." Sarah and James and the group of survivors went their separate ways. As the sun began to set, James suggested they all go to his apartment to hold up for the night and organize their supplies. As the night set in and the sun fell below the horizon, they reached James' apartment. Chapter 7: Gathering Resources. The heavy thud of the apartment door slamming shut behind them sent a jolt of unease through James Grady's body. He stood there, his eyes sweeping across the familiar surroundings that had become a fragile sanctuary amidst the chaos. The once orderly space was now cluttered with supplies, a testament to the desperation that had consumed the world beyond these walls. James turned to Sarah, his gaze searching her face for any sign of the terror they had faced just moments ago. Her expression was tense, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes that reassured him. They were alive, and they had the medical supplies they so desperately needed. "We made it," James said, his voice low and measured, betraying the turmoil that raged within him. Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the first aid kit she held in her hands. "For now," she replied, her tone tinged with uncertainty. "But we can't afford to let our guard down. Not in this world." James understood the weight of her words. The world they had once known had been shattered, replaced by a harsh reality where survival was a daily battle. He watched as Sarah methodically sorted through the contents of the kit, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These supplies could make all the difference," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the various items. "Antiseptics, bandages, sutures, they'll be crucial in the days to come." James listened intently, his respect for her expertise growing with each passing moment. He had always been a practical, self-reliant man, but he recognized the value of having a skilled medic by his side. As Sarah explained the significance of each item, James found himself hanging on her every word, eager to learn. "The scissors and gauze will be essential for treating wounds," Sarah continued, her voice calm and assured. "And this saline solution, it can help prevent infection and keep us hydrated." She looked up at James, her green eyes meeting his with a newfound intensity. "We're going to need all of this and more if we're going to make it." James felt a surge of gratitude towards this woman who had become his unexpected ally. Her knowledge and determination were a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed the world outside, and he found himself drawn to the steadiness she exuded. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with sincerity. Sarah offered him a small, wistful smile. "We're in this together now," she replied, her hand reaching out to give his arm a gentle squeeze. "I'm not going anywhere." The simple gesture sent a wave of relief through James, and he felt a glimmer of hope take root in the midst of the darkness. He knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, but with Sarah by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their moment of connection was shattered by a sudden, jarring crash from outside, causing them both to jump. James instinctively moved towards the window, his heart pounding in his chest as he peered through the curtains. The streets were alive with chaos once again, as a group of desperate survivors looted a nearby OKC outlet, their frantic movements sending debris flying into the air. James watched, his jaw clenched, as they ripped through the front windows, their only goal to secure the supplies they needed to survive. Sarah came to stand beside him, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before them. "We can't just sit back and watch," she said, her voice laced with concern. "We need to do something." James turned to her, his expression torn. "I know," his hand tightening around the strap of his backpack, "but we can't afford to take unnecessary risks. One wrong move, and we could end up dead." The two fell silent, each grappling with the weight of their situation. James knew that they couldn't remain passive observers, but the thought of venturing out into the chaos filled him with dread. His survivalist instincts warred with his desire to help, and he could see the same internal conflict reflected in Sarah's eyes. "We need to come up with a plan," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We can't just hunker down here forever. We'll need to venture out eventually, and we need to be prepared." James nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "All right," he said, his voice resolute. "Let's scout out the nearby neighborhoods, see if we can find any less chaotic areas that might still have supplies." Sarah's expression brightened, and James felt a surge of relief at the sight of her determination. "Okay," she replied, her hand gripping his arm. "But we need to be careful. Stealth and caution will be our best allies out there." James couldn't help but feel a sense of solidarity with this woman who had become his unexpected partner. They had faced the horrors of the undead together, and in doing so had forged a bond that went beyond mere survival. He knew that he could trust her, that she would have his back, and that knowledge gave him the strength to face the challenges that lay ahead. As they gathered their gear, James felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. The world outside had changed, and he knew that they were stepping into danger. But with Sarah by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would face this new reality together, and they would do whatever it took to survive. With a deep breath, James led the way to the door, his hand gripping the handle with a steely determination. He glanced back at Sarah, his gaze meeting hers, and in that moment they shared an unspoken understanding. They were in this together, come what may. Chapter 8. Marcus joins the fray. As they stepped out into the desolate streets, the air was thick with tension. The once familiar landmarks of Oklahoma City had been transformed into a haunting landscape, debris and abandoned vehicles littering the roads. The distant sounds of chaos echoed in the background, a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence. James and Sarah moved with a sense of purpose, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. They had decided to scout the nearby neighborhoods, hoping to find a less chaotic area that might still have the supplies they needed to fortify their sanctuary. As they made their way through the deserted streets, James couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia for the vibrant city he had once known. The bustling brick town, the lively entertainment district, and the thriving community events, all of it had been reduced to a haunting, desolate landscape. "This place used to be so alive," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the crumbling buildings and the debris-strewn sidewalks. Sarah glanced at him, her expression somber. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to believe this is the same city we once knew." James nodded, his jaw clenching with a mixture of grief and determination. "We have to find a way to make it through this," he said, his eyes hardening with resolve. "For the sake of what we've lost and for the chance to build something new." Sarah reached out, her hand grasping his arm in a gesture of understanding. "We will," she said, her voice firm, "but we can't do it alone. We need to find others who are willing to fight for a future." James felt a surge of gratitude towards this woman who had become his unexpected ally. Her words resonated with him, echoing the very thoughts that had been weighing on his mind. The idea of building a new community, of forging bonds in the midst of this chaos, filled him with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt since the outbreak began. As they continued their search, the duo encountered a small group of survivors huddled in the shadows of a dilapidated building. Their faces were etched with fear and desperation, and James felt a pang of empathy for their plight. Approaching them cautiously, James raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We mean you no harm," he said, his voice low and measured. "We're just looking for supplies and a safe place to hunker down." The survivors eyed them warily, their bodies tense with apprehension. One of them, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, stepped forward, his gaze narrowed. "You're not the first ones to come around looking for a handout," he growled, his voice laced with suspicion. "What makes you think we can trust you?" James felt Sarah's hand on his arm, a silent plea for him to handle the situation with care. He took a deep breath, his mind racing as he searched for the right words. "Look, I get it," he said, his tone calm and measured. "Trust is hard to come by these days, but we're not here to take anything from you. We just want to work together, to pool our resources and keep each other safe." The man's expression softened slightly, and James could see the glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Safe, huh?" he muttered, his gaze shifting between James and Sarah. "That's a pretty tall order these days." Sarah stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "We know it's a risk," she said, her green eyes meeting the man's with a steadiness that belied her own fears. "But we're all in this together now. We have medical supplies, and we can share them if you're willing to let us join you." The man considered her words, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally he nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "All right then," he said, extending his hand. "The name's Marcus. Welcome to our little sanctuary." James felt a surge of relief wash over him as he grasped Marcus's hand, the weight of their newfound alliance settling upon his shoulders. He knew that trust would be a fragile commodity in this new world, but the prospect of working together, of building a community, filled him with a glimmer of hope. As they followed Marcus deeper into the building, James couldn't help but glance at Sarah, his eyes reflecting the same determination that burned within her. They were in this together, and they would do whatever it took to survive. Chapter 9. Forging Bonds. The dim light of the warehouse cast an eerie glow over the makeshift gathering space where James, Sarah, and Marcus had convened. The weight of their recent ordeals hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that belied the fragility of their newfound alliance. James cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his companions as he took the lead. "All right, we need to figure out a plan, a real plan, if we're going to make it in this new world." His voice was low and measured, betraying the turmoil that raged within him. Sarah nodded, her green eyes meeting his with a steely determination. "You're right. We can't just hunker down and hope for the best. We need to be proactive, to use our strengths and resources to secure a safe haven." Marcus, his arms crossed over his chest, leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "And what exactly do you two have in mind?" He growled, his tone laced with a hint of distrust. James took a deep breath, his mind racing as he recalled the survival tactics his parents had drilled into him over the years. "We need to establish roles within the group," he began, his gaze shifting between Sarah and Marcus. "Sarah, your medical expertise is going to be crucial. We need you to take charge of our supplies and ensure we're prepared to treat any injuries or illnesses." Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the first aid kit that rested on the table. Absolutely. These supplies could make all the difference in the days to come. Antiseptics, bandages, sutures, they'll be essential for keeping us alive. James felt a surge of gratitude towards this woman who had become his unexpected ally. Her knowledge and determination were a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed the world outside, and he found himself drawn to the steadiness she exuded. And Marcus, he continued, turning his attention to the former military operative, your tactical skills and experience are going to be invaluable. We need you to take point on security, to help us fortify this place and keep an eye out for any threats. Marcus's expression softened slightly, and James could see the glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "All right, I can do that," he replied, his voice gruff but tinged with a hint of respect. "But we're going to need to work as a team if we're going to make it." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had always been a practical, self-reliant man, but he recognized the value of having a skilled medic and a seasoned military operative by his side. As Sarah and Marcus discussed the specifics of their roles, James listened intently, his respect for their expertise growing with each passing moment. Suddenly, a loud crash from outside shattered the relative calm, causing the trio to jump in their seats. James's heart raced as he instinctively reached for his baseball bat, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the dimly lit warehouse for any sign of danger. Sarah's hand gripped his arm, her voice low and urgent. "What was that?" James shook his head, his jaw clenched with tension. "I don't know, but we need to be ready." He turned to Marcus, his gaze hardening. "You take the rear entrance. Sarah and I will cover the front." Marcus nodded, his expression grim, as he moved towards the back of the warehouse, his steps measured and cautious. James and Sarah crept towards the cracked windows, peering out into the eerie silence of the desolate streets. The sight that greeted them sent a chill down their spines. A horde of zombies, their grotesque features illuminated by the dim light, were shambling down the street, their movements erratic and unnatural. James felt a surge of panic, his heart pounding in his chest as he realized the gravity of their situation. "We need to create a distraction," he whispered, his gaze shifting towards Sarah. "Something to draw them away from the main entrance." Sarah's brow furrowed in concentration, her mind racing as she scanned the warehouse for potential materials. "Over there," she murmured, gesturing towards a pile of scrap metal and broken glass. "We can use that to make some noise, lure them away." James nodded, his grip tightening on his bat. "All right, let's do it. But be careful. We can't afford to attract any more of them." The two moved with a sense of purpose, their movements quick and precise as they gathered the materials. Marcus rejoined them, his expression grim, but his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I'll take the rear," he said, his voice low and steady. "You two focus on the distraction. I'll make sure nothing gets in from behind." James felt a surge of gratitude towards the former soldier, his respect for Marcus growing with each passing moment. "Sounds good," he replied, his hand clasping Marcus's shoulder in a gesture of camaraderie. "Let's do this." As they set their plan into motion, the air was thick with tension. Sarah carefully arranged the scrap metal and broken glass, her fingers deftly manipulating the materials to create a cacophony of sound. James and Marcus stood at the ready, their weapons gripped tightly as they listened for any sign of the approaching horde. The moment of truth arrived with a sudden, guttural growl, and the trio sprang into action. Sarah sent the materials clattering to the ground, the echoing crash reverberating through the warehouse. James and Marcus moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves to intercept any zombies that might try to breach their sanctuary. The plan worked, the undead drawn towards the noise like moths to a flame. James watched with a mixture of relief and revulsion as the horde shambled past their position, their vacant eyes and twisted features a stark reminder of the horrors that now threatened their existence. As the last of the zombies disappeared from view, the trio allowed themselves a moment to catch their breath, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. James turned to Sarah, his expression filled with a newfound respect. "That was some quick thinking," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Sarah offered him a small, wistful smile. "We're in this together now," she replied, her hand reaching out to give his arm a gentle squeeze. I'm not going anywhere. The simple gesture sent a wave of relief through James, and he felt a glimmer of hope take root in the midst of the darkness. He knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, but with Sarah and Marcus by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Marcus, his gaze fixed on the receding horde, cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the others. "We need to find a more secure location," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with a hint of urgency. "This place is too exposed." James nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "You're right. We need to scout the area, see if we can find a place that's better fortified and has the supplies we need to hunker down." The trio exchanged a series of determined glances, the weight of their situation pressing down upon them. They knew that the challenges ahead would be daunting, but they were ready to face them, united in their struggle for survival. As they gathered their gear and prepared to venture out into the desolate streets, James couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected bonds they had forged in the midst of this chaos. The world they had once known had been shattered, but in the face of adversity, they had found strength in each other. Chapter 10: Clash of Survivors. The dim glow of the flashlight cast an eerie shadow over the makeshift war room where James, Sarah, and Marcus had gathered. The air was thick with tension as they pored over a hastily sketched map of the surrounding area, their faces etched with a mixture of determination and trepidation. "All right, listen up," James began, his voice low and measured. "We know that rival group has been encroaching on our territory, and they're not going to stop until they've taken everything we've worked for." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his companions. "We need to be proactive. We need to fortify our position and be ready to defend it at all costs." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "James is right. We can't afford to sit back and wait for them to make the first move. We need a plan, a solid plan, if we're going to have any chance of coming out of this on top." Marcus, his arms crossed over his chest, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "So, what exactly do you two have in mind?" he growled, his tone laced with a hint of skepticism. James took a deep breath, his mind racing with the details of their strategy. "We need to reinforce the perimeter, set up tripwires and alarms to give us early warning, and we need to stockpile supplies, food, water, medical supplies, everything we'll need to hold out if they try to lay siege to this place." Sarah chimed in, her voice calm and assured. "I'll take inventory of our medical supplies, make sure we're fully stocked and ready to treat any injuries. We can't afford to be caught off guard." Marcus nodded, his expression softening slightly. "All right, that's a good start. I'll handle the security and fortifications. We need to make this place as impenetrable as possible." The trio fell silent for a moment, the weight of their situation pressing down upon them. The distant sounds of chaos, the occasional scream, the rumble of a collapsing building, served as a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked beyond the walls of their sanctuary. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl pierced the air, sending a chill down James's spine. He gripped the edge of the table, his heart pounding in his chest as he strained to listen. "You hear that?" he whispered, his eyes narrowing. Sarah and Marcus nodded, their bodies tensing as they readied themselves for a confrontation. "Sounds like our uninvited guests are getting closer," Marcus muttered, his hand reaching for the rifle that leaned against the wall. James felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. "All right, let's move. Sarah, you stay here and secure the medical supplies. Marcus and I will take the front." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the look in James's eyes silenced her. She knew that in this new world, hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. "Be careful," she said, her voice laced with concern. James offered her a small, reassuring smile. "We will. Just stay safe, okay?" With that, he and Marcus moved towards the entrance, their footsteps muffled by the debris-strewn floor. The air was thick with tension, and James could feel the weight of their responsibility pressing down upon him. As they approached the door, James paused, his hand gripping the handle. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and then pushed it open, stepping out into the eerie silence of the desolate streets. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos and devastation. The once vibrant Bricktown district had been reduced to a haunting landscape, debris and abandoned vehicles littering the roads. The distant sounds of gunfire and the occasional scream only heightened the sense of unease that had settled over the area. James and Marcus moved with a sense of purpose, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the approaching threat. The faint growls and the shuffling of feet grew louder with each passing moment, and James felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Suddenly, a group of figures emerged from the gloom, their movements erratic and unnatural. James's grip tightened on his baseball bat as he recognized the telltale signs of the undead: the vacant stares, the bloodied clothing, the twisted, decaying features. "Looks like we've got company," Marcus growled, his rifle raised and ready. James nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "Let's do this." The two men sprang into action, their movements fluid and coordinated as they fended off the approaching horde. James swung his bat with precision, each blow connecting with the zombies' heads with a sickening crunch. Marcus, his military training evident in his every move, picked off the creatures with a series of well-aimed shots, his expression grim but unwavering. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the sounds of the struggle, the guttural moans of the undead, the shouts of the living, and the occasional crack of gunfire. James felt a surge of revulsion as he watched the zombies fall, their lifeless bodies crumpling to the ground, but he pushed past the nausea, his focus solely on keeping himself and Marcus alive. As the last of the zombies collapsed, the two men paused, their chests heaving with exertion. James glanced around, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the rival group, his heart pounding in his chest. "You think that's all of them?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Marcus shook his head, his gaze narrowed. "Doubt it. These things always travel in packs. We need to get back inside, regroup with Sarah, and figure out our next move." James nodded, his mind racing with the implications of their situation. The rival group was still out there, and they were clearly a force to be reckoned with. He knew that they couldn't afford to let their guard down, not for a second. As they hurried back to the warehouse, James couldn't help but feel a pang of worry for Sarah. She was alone, vulnerable, and he knew that she was the key to their survival. He quickened his pace, his grip tightening on his bat, his determination to protect his newfound allies fueling his every step. When they reached the warehouse, James burst through the door, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior for any sign of trouble. Sarah stood near the medical supplies, her expression tense but resolute. "Are you both all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. James nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "We're fine, but we need to be ready. That was just the first wave. The rival group is still out there, and they're not going to stop until they've taken everything we've got." Sarah's eyes widened, and she quickly began to gather the medical supplies, her movements precise and efficient. "Then we need to fortify this place, make it as secure as possible. We can't afford to be caught off guard." Marcus stepped forward, his expression grim. "Agreed. I'll get started on the perimeter, set up some tripwires and alarms to give us early warning. We need to be ready for anything." James felt a surge of gratitude towards his companions, their dedication and resilience a testament to the strength of their newfound alliance. He knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, but with Sarah and Marcus by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. As they set about their tasks, James couldn't help but reflect on the weight of their situation. The world they had once known had been shattered, replaced by a harsh reality where survival was a daily battle. But in the midst of the chaos, they had found strength in one another, forging a bond that could be the key to their salvation. The sounds of their preparations echoed through the warehouse, a steady rhythm that underscored the gravity of their predicament. James knew that the rival group would not be deterred, that they would stop at nothing to claim the resources they had worked so hard to secure. But as he watched Sarah and Marcus move with a sense of purpose, their faces showing with determination, he felt a glimmer of hope take root within him. They were in this together, and they would do whatever it took to protect their sanctuary and the fragile community they had built.